My son never had any extraordinary talents, except one: he has a gift for marrying troublemakers. My daughter-in-law has a special talent too, turning my quiet life upside down and forcing me to play the hardest games life can offer right in my golden years. Curious to know what kind of game that was? Stay with me for today's story. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, my dear viewers. My daughter-in-law Marissa pushes me out of the house every morning. She says it is good for my health to walk to get some fresh air, but I know better. She wants me gone out of sight, out of the way. That morning the air was crisp with the scent of falling leaves, and I walked down the street just as I always did. But halfway to the park, I realized I had forgotten my wallet. I turned back quietly, thinking she would not even notice. As I approached the house, I saw her car still in the driveway. Odd. She usually left after I did. Something about it felt wrong. I opened the door gently, my heart tightening in my chest. Then I heard it. Whispering. A soft, hurried conversation coming from Marissa's bedroom. I froze, holding my breath. There was another voice, not hers. A woman's voice, smooth and cold. One I hadn't heard in years yet could never forget. My hands started to tremble. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the door. The words came through in broken pieces. When the inheritance comes through, we'll set the scene. She's old, no one will suspect. My knees nearly gave out. They were talking about me. My own daughter-in-law plotting something unspeakable with that voice from the past, the one connected to the deepest wound of my life. But I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The room spun around me as my mind tried to catch up with what my ears had just heard. I backed away slowly, clutching the wall for balance. My breath came in shallow bursts. Every instinct told me to run, yet my body stayed frozen. For years I had tolerated Marissa's insults, her fake sweetness in front of my son, the way she treated me like a burden. But this was something else entirely. Outside, the wind picked up scattering dry leaves across the porch. I stepped out, closing the door without a sound. My hands were cold, my heart pounding. The betrayal burned inside me, silent but sharp. I have always believed that discipline is a form of love. For 35 years, I taught English at a high school in Ohio, where my students called me strict but fair. I kept a jar of red pens on my desk, each one a reminder that effort deserved correction, not punishment. I was never the popular teacher yet. Decades later, I still receive Christmas cards from former students who say, I taught them more than grammar. I taught them accountability. When my husband Richard passed away from a sudden heart attack 15 years ago, I refused to let grief turn me into a dependent widow. I managed what we had: his life insurance, my pension, and the modest savings we'd built over the years. I invested carefully. Nothing grand, just small certificates and municipal bonds, the kind of quiet stability I could understand. In time, I bought a small 2-bedroom condo in Cleveland Heights. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine alone legally and financially. The deed had only my name on it, and I took quiet pride in that. My son Timothy offered to have me move in with him after his wedding, but I declined. I didn't want to be a burden. I told him that independence was not selfishness, it was survival. Later, when he insisted I stay temporarily with them after my knee surgery, I agreed just until I recovered. Somehow that temporary arrangement stretched into months. I am an old-fashioned woman. I wake up early, make breakfast, balance my checkbook by hand, and write grocery lists with neat, cursive lines. I keep receipts in labeled envelopes and track every expense in a notebook. To younger people like Marissa, my daughter-in-law, these habits make me seem outdated, perhaps even controlling. But to me, order is peace. In the quiet evenings, I sometimes reread my husband's letters. Careful handwriting, thoughtful words, always reminding me to protect myself. He used to say, "A woman who holds her own keys never fears being locked out." I kept that advice close to my heart, and to this day, every document, account, and property I own remains in my control. I didn't realize then how prophetic that would become. Because one day, those same papers, those neat little files everyone mocked, would be the very thing that saved me. My son Timothy has always had a gentle heart. At 38, he works as a baker in a small shop downtown known for his patience and steady hands. People love his cinnamon rolls, soft and golden, the kind that make the whole street smell like comfort. He's the kind of man who apologizes even when something isn't his fault, who believes the best in everyone even when he shouldn't. But behind that calm smile is a quiet storm of guilt. For years, Timothy has carried the belief that he disappointed me, that because he never became a manager or bought a big house like his friends, he somehow failed as a son. I never said that to him. Not once. Yet he convinced himself I expected more. Krista, his ex-wife, saw that weakness before I did, and she used it like a weapon. She made him feel small, like a man who could never earn respect without her approval. When their marriage collapsed, it was Timothy who took the blame, even though Krista had drained their joint accounts and left him buried under her credit card debts. I still remember the night he moved back in with me. He stood in the doorway holding a single suitcase, eyes red, voice trembling, as he said, "Mom, I don't even know who I am anymore." I didn't lecture him. I just made tea and listened. And those months were hard. Depression settled over him like fog. He worked extra shifts, but barely made enough to cover the interest on Krista's bills. I watched him fade, that kind, smiling boy, replaced by a man too afraid to trust his own choices. I wanted to protect him, but every time I tried, he pulled away, saying he needed to fix things himself. Then came Marissa. She met him at the bakery, or so he said. She smiled too easily, flattered too quickly, and never missed a chance to mention how grateful she was to find a man so gentle. I sensed danger immediately, that same practiced charm, the same tone Krista used when she first entered our lives. Later, I learned they had been in contact long before Marissa and Timothy ever met. It was not love, it was recruitment. Timothy didn't see it. He only saw someone who made him feel needed again. He mistook manipulation for affection, just as he always did. My heart broke watching him walk into the same trap. Twice his kindness turned against him once more. He was my only son, my soft-hearted boy, and without knowing it, he was already surrounded by wolves. Krista Dalton once walked into my life wearing pearls and a perfect smile. The kind of woman who could charm an entire room before anyone realized how calculating she truly was. She worked in insurance sharp with numbers and fluent in the language of loopholes. Back then, I mistook her confidence for competence. It wasn't until later that I learned she had used her knowledge not to protect people, but to exploit them. She opened credit accounts under my son Timothy's name, then under mine. At first, the bills seemed like clerical errors, tiny charges, small withdrawals. By the time I pieced it together, she had already forged signatures and taken loans using fake documents. When the truth came out, the police called it a minor fraud case, but for me, it was a betrayal that cut deep. I still remember standing in that courtroom, my hands trembling as I testified against her. Timothy couldn't even look at me, but I had to do it. Justice, I told myself, must start at home. Krista received a suspended sentence and was ordered to repay part of what she stole. To the court, it was closure. To her, it was humiliation. She walked out of that courthouse with eyes that no longer smiled, cold, venomous eyes that promised payback. I could feel her hatred before she even spoke it. After her conviction, she lost everything: her job, her reputation, her circle of friends. No company wanted to hire a fraudster. No friend wanted to be associated with scandal. She started drifting between cities, living off favors and manipulation. And when that wasn't enough, she found new company among people who shared her skill for deceit, a small network that specialized in forging inheritance documents and laundering money through false estates. It was there, among liars and opportunists, that she found Marissa Fordham. Marissa was younger, prettier, and broke. She had just lost her job, owed money, and was desperate for a way out. Krista saw what she needed: someone to act the part, someone believable, someone who could smile and lie without hesitation. And so, she molded her. Marissa became her project, her instrument of revenge. Together, they built a plan to crawl back into Timothy's life, and by extension, mine. But this time, Krista would not appear directly. She preferred the shadows, pulling strings where no one could see. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice from that morning behind Marissa's door. I didn't need to see her to know. Hatred has a sound of its own, and Krista's voice carried it perfectly. Marissa Fordham appeared in Timothy's life like spring sunlight after a long winter. They met through a dating app only 3 months after Krista was released from prison. Her profile said she was a nutrition consultant, studied food science in another state, and wanted a simple, honest man who values family. To someone as gentle and wounded as Timothy, it sounded like redemption. She texted him every morning with cheerful messages about breakfast, sent photos of healthy meals, and told him that kindness was the most attractive quality in a man. When Timothy introduced her to me, she carried a basket of homemade soup and hydrangeas. Her smile was warm, her tone sweet but practiced. "I just want to take care of you like my own mother," she said, placing her hand lightly on mine. I wanted to believe her. After all, what kind of woman says something so tender to her future mother-in-law on a first visit? For months, she maintained the image of a devoted partner and a loving daughter. She helped with groceries, washed dishes, and always asked, "Do you need me to drive you anywhere, Mom?" It felt genuine, almost too genuine. Their wedding was small and quiet, just a few friends at a garden in the suburbs. I remember thinking how radiant she looked in that soft ivory dress, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes filled with something I mistook for affection. But the change began almost immediately after the vows were spoken. Within weeks, she started managing their household expenses to make things easier. She suggested combining accounts for transparency, she said. Then she began commenting on my spending, why I still paid for certain subscriptions, why I bought the brand of tea I liked. Her tone was polite but sharp, every word cloaked in fake concern. Soon she insisted every bill be split evenly. "It's only fair," she said. "You're home most of the time, using more electricity and water." I stared at her speechless, realizing she had just turned my presence in my own house into a financial burden. Timothy looked caught between us eyes, pleading for peace. He muttered something about misunderstanding, but I knew better. Marissa wasn't misunderstanding anything. She was measuring, calculating, testing how far she could push before someone pushed back. By the end of that month, she had full control of their finances. She started keeping the checkbook in her handbag, locking her phone whenever she texted, and smiling too sweetly whenever I walked into the room. The warm, caring woman who once brought me flowers had vanished, replaced by someone colder, sharper, and eerily familiar. It was then I realized Krista hadn't just vanished from our lives. She had found her successor. At first, I told myself it was just clumsiness. Sweaters can shrink, recipes can go wrong, but it kept happening. My favorite cashmere cardigan came out of the washer the size of a child's jacket. The soup I made from my late husband's recipe, one I'd cooked for decades, suddenly tasted like ocean water after Marissa helped by adding a spoonful of salt. She laughed, said she was just trying to help me learn new flavors. I smiled politely, but inside something twisted. Then came the whispers. She would lean close to Timothy and murmur just loud enough for me to hear, "Your mother doesn't respect me. She treats me like a guest, not family. She still controls everything here." I could see how her words burrowed into him, how his shoulders tensed every time he looked at me. The boy who once called me every evening now avoided eye contact across the breakfast table. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just a clash of generations, two women trying to share one roof. But soon, things crossed into the absurd. One morning, I came home from a walk and found the locks changed on the back door. Marissa claimed she just wanted to increase security. A week later, the Wi-Fi password no longer worked, and she told me casually, "We had to change it for privacy reasons." When I asked for it, she smiled and said she'd text it later, but never did. The final straw came when my friend Helen stopped by one afternoon with a pie. Marissa opened the door only halfway and said Lauren's resting. She doesn't like surprise visitors. I was in the living room. I heard every word. I stepped out embarrassed and furious and said clearly, "Marissa, this is my home. You don't tell my friends what I like or don't like." Her eyes filled instantly with tears, as if I had slapped her. That evening, she sobbed in front of Timothy, claiming I had humiliated her. By morning, she had posted a long message online about living with a toxic in-law who refuses to respect boundaries. Neighbors began to whisper old friends stopped calling, and even the cashier at the local store gave me sympathetic looks. My dignity, something I had spent a lifetime protecting, was being slowly stripped away, one lie at a time. When I confronted her again, telling her firmly that if she wanted to stay in my house, she needed to show respect, she tilted her head and smiled through her tears. "Maybe it's time you found your own place, Lauren. You deserve peace." Peace. The word echoed bitterly in my mind. They were living in my house, sleeping under my roof, and yet I was the one being pushed out. That night, as I sat alone in the dark kitchen, I realized it wasn't confusion or misunderstanding anymore. It was a plan. A deliberate, careful dismantling of my life, and it had only just begun. Every morning at exactly 7, Marissa's voice would ring down the hallway, polite, but unmistakably commanding. "Time for your walk, Mom. You said you wanted to stay healthy, remember?" I would nod, pretending it was my choice, grab my coat and step outside into the cool Cleveland air. The moment the door shut behind me, I would hear the sound of the bolt sliding twice. Once. Twice. As if I were an intruder being locked out, not the owner of the condo. At first, I told myself she was just being cautious. The neighborhood wasn't what it used to be, and maybe she feared break-ins. But that logic began to crumble when I noticed she only locked me out on days Timothy wasn't home. On weekends, when he stayed in the door, remained open. The locks clicked only when I was alone with her. That's when unease started to grow into something sharper: suspicion. She began making these exercise mornings longer. If I came home too early, she'd greet me with feigned surprise. "Oh, you're back already. You didn't walk enough. You have to keep your heart strong." There was always that same syrupy tone, the kind that dripped with control. She'd usher me toward the kitchen, hand me tea, and act as if nothing had happened. Then one morning, I decided to test her. I left at 7 as usual, but instead of heading to the park, I waited by the corner cafe across the street. From there, I could see our building entrance clearly. At 7:40, a silver SUV pulled up in front of the complex, a car I'd never seen before. The driver stayed inside, glancing at his phone. A few minutes later, Marissa appeared at the door. She looked around carefully, then walked straight to the vehicle. My heart thudded as I watched her open the back door and take a large black bag from the driver. It looked heavy. She glanced toward the street, nervous, then carried it inside her steps, quick and deliberate. Whatever was in that bag, she didn't want me or anyone else to see. I stood frozen behind the cafe window, pretending to stir my coffee while my mind raced. I wanted to march back and demand answers, but something told me not to. Not yet. I needed to see what game she was playing. When I returned home 30 minutes later, she was sitting calmly on the sofa, hair perfectly brushed, a cup of tea steaming beside her. "Good walk, Mom?" she asked sweetly. I glanced toward the hallway where faint traces of black dust marked the floor near the door. My eyes met hers, and she smiled, too long, too steady. That was the morning I knew the walks weren't about health. They were about absence mine. And for the first time, I realized that whatever Marissa was doing behind that locked door, it was never meant for me to find out. I started keeping notes. Old habits die hard for a teacher. When something doesn't make sense, you document it. In a worn leather notebook, the same one I used to grade essays years ago, I began writing everything down. Date, time, detail. It began with small things. The hallway light flickering on, even when I knew I'd switched it off. Faint footsteps after midnight, the refrigerator door closing when I wasn't in the kitchen. Little things that made me question my own memory until they began to form a pattern. The utility bills were the next clue. My electric and water bills nearly doubled within 2 months, yet I was out of the house most mornings. Maybe the meter's wrong, I told myself, but something inside me whispered otherwise. Someone was using this apartment while I was gone. Someone was living a second life inside my home. One afternoon, I came back early from the grocery store and stopped dead at the front door. A faint chemical smell hung in the air, sharp metallic like fresh paint mixed with cleaning solvent. I followed it into the living room, where the windows were open wide, curtains tied back, and plastic sheets spread neatly across the floor. Marissa was standing there wearing gloves and holding a small roller brush. She looked up startled, then quickly smiled. "Oh, I was just touching up the walls," she said lightly. "The apartment felt dull, and I thought a fresh coat would make it brighter. You don't mind, do you, Mom?" Her tone was sweet, but her eyes darted too quickly. The smell was wrong, not just paint, something sharper, the kind used for industrial coatings or metalwork. I watched her gather the tools into a black bag, the same kind I'd seen her carry from that silver SUV. When I asked where she got the materials, she shrugged. "A friend gave them to me. You know I like being handy." Then she laughed a little too loud. That night, I sat in bed with my notebook open on my lap. I wrote chemical smell, paint excuse, nervous behavior, possible cover-up. My hand trembled as I underlined the words twice. Years of teaching had taught me how to recognize rehearsed behavior, the kind students use when lying about missing homework. Marissa was rehearsing something, but it wasn't redecorating. The next morning, I checked the living room again. The walls looked no different. No new paint, no change in color. Only the faint trace of that chemical smell remained. I stood there realizing the chilling truth: she wasn't painting. She was practicing something else, something that required precision, secrecy, and time when I was away. My instincts told me this was no longer about household tensions. It was preparation for what I didn't yet know, but the teacher in me had just turned into an investigator. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was folding laundry in Timothy's room, something I often did just to feel close to my son again. He had left for work early, and the air still carried the faint smell of flour from his bakery uniform. I lifted a stack of shirts when something unfamiliar caught my eye: a brown leather jacket, soft, but worn, clearly not new. The initials, KD, were stitched neatly into the collar in gold thread. I froze. Those letters didn't belong to Timothy. They belonged to Krista Dalton. My breath caught as my fingers brushed the embroidery. It was the same style she used to wear cropped waist double stitching on the sleeves. I remembered because I had once complimented her on it at a family dinner years ago before everything fell apart. And now that same jacket was here in my son's closet months after Krista's release from prison. I turned it over slowly, examining the lining. A faint perfume lingered, sharp and floral, not Marissa's scent. Krista used to wear the same one velvet rose. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around me. The light dimmed, the air thickened. I could almost hear Krista's voice again, smooth, mocking, confident. Just then, the door opened. Marissa stepped in holding her phone. When her eyes landed on the jacket, her expression shifted for a split second, a flash of alarm quickly masked by a smile. "Oh, that," she said too quickly. "It's from a friend. She gave it to me because it didn't fit her anymore." Her tone was casual, but her hands betrayed her. She placed her phone on the table and gripped the edge with just enough pressure to turn her knuckles white. I had seen that exact gesture before from Krista when the police questioned her in court, a small, involuntary tick that came whenever she lied. I smiled softly, pretending not to notice. "It's a lovely jacket," I said. "Your friend must have great taste." Marissa nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Yeah, she does." Then she grabbed the jacket a little too fast and walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. When the door closed, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the air heavy with realization. The initials, the perfume, the mannerisms. It all connected. Krista's ghost had never really left, she had simply changed faces. That evening, as I wrote in my notebook, I didn't label it coincidence. I wrote one word: connection. Because deep down, I knew Krista and Marissa were not separate stories. They were chapters of the same plot, stitched together just like that jacket. When I finally told Timothy what I had seen, I chose my words carefully. I didn't want to sound paranoid or bitter. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light spilling through the blinds, coffee steaming between us. I said quietly, "Tim, I found a leather jacket in your closet. It had the initials KD on the collar. You do remember what those letters stand for, don't you?" He looked up from his mug, half smiling, half tired. "Mom, you're overthinking again," he said softly. "Krista's gone. Maybe Marissa just got it secondhand. Lots of women have similar clothes. It's not a big deal." There it was, that tone. Calm, dismissive, rehearsed. It wasn't the voice of my son anymore. It was filtered, softened, as if he were afraid to upset someone listening behind the door. I searched his face for the boy who used to laugh with me over burnt pancakes in old movies, but all I saw was hesitation. His shoulders tensed. His eyes flickered toward the hallway, toward her. "I just worry about you, that's all I said. Some things around here don't add up." He sighed, set down his mug and said, "Marissa's been trying her best, Mom. You always assume the worst." Then he smiled again, but it wasn't warmth. It was apology to his wife, not to me. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I realized then that every word I spoke in this house could be twisted, every doubt turned against me. She had built it perfectly, this quiet wall between mother and son. Not made of bricks or anger, but of small misunderstandings and carefully planted seeds of mistrust. I wanted to reach across the table, take his hand, and remind him of everything we'd survived together. His father's passing, the years of struggle, the laughter that once filled this home. But I didn't. I could see it in his eyes. If I pushed, I'd lose him completely. So I smiled instead, a tired, practiced smile, and said, "You're right, dear. Maybe I just think too much." He relaxed, relieved that I'd dropped the subject, and left for work soon after. When the door closed, the house felt colder than before. The ticking of the clock was the only sound left, each second marking the distance growing between us. That day, I stopped talking, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I realized words had become useless weapons in this silent war. From then on, I would listen more than I spoke, watch more than I asked, and wait for the truth to show itself. Because deep down, I knew this battle wasn't about a jacket or suspicion anymore. It was about reclaiming my son before Marissa erased the last piece of me left in him. I decided to start keeping records, not just notes, but evidence. Years of teaching had trained me to look for patterns, to notice what others dismissed. One evening, while cleaning the drawer in my desk, I found a small voice recorder. It was a birthday gift from an old student who became a journalist. I used it once during a school interview years ago and then forgot about it. Now it felt like fate placing it back in my hands. The next morning, while Marissa was upstairs, I quietly set the recorder behind the flower vase on the kitchen counter. The red light blinked once, then went still. I told myself it was just for reassurance to know what really happened in this house when I was sent out for my morning walks. Still, my heart pounded like I was committing a crime in my own home. That day, I acted as though nothing had changed. I asked Marissa about dinner plans, complimented her cooking, and even offered to fold the laundry. She smiled, pretending to be warm, but her eyes stayed guarded. I asked casually, "Do you ever hear from Krista?" She must have had such an influence on Timothy back then. Her fork paused mid-air. Then she smiled, too sweetly. "Oh, I don't know her well," she said. "Tim mentioned her once, but I don't really care about his past." The tone was dismissive, almost rehearsed. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair, that same unconscious gesture Krista used when she lied. I wanted to push further, but I knew better. Each question made her more careful, more secretive. So I smiled back, acting the part of the harmless aging mother. Inside, though, I was writing a different script, one of quiet observation and patient truth. That evening, when she went out to meet a friend, I retrieved the recorder. My hands trembled as I plugged in the earphones. For the first few minutes, there was only the sound of dishes clinking water, running the hum of the refrigerator, then a faint voice hers. "Don't call this number again," she whispered sharply. "I told you we'll handle it my way." Silence followed, then the sound of a door closing. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't proof yet, just a thread. But in my notebook, under the heading, Personal Investigation File, I wrote, "Voice recorder planted in kitchen. Evidence of secret call. Mentions of outside coordination." I looked at those words for a long time before closing the notebook. My hands were cold, but my mind felt clearer than ever. Whatever Marissa was doing, she wasn't doing it alone. And if she thought I was just an old woman losing her memory, she was about to learn that experience is its own kind of weapon. That Tuesday morning, I almost didn't leave the house. My knees ached, the sky was heavy with rain, and I told myself I deserved a day off from those pointless morning walks. But something that old teacher's instinct, that quiet warning bell inside me, told me to go anyway. I walked just a few blocks, then stopped. My heart felt uneasy, as if I had forgotten something important. Without knowing why, I turned back. When I reached the building, the silence felt different. No music, no sound of dishes, no hum of the television that Marissa always kept on. I slipped off my shoes at the door and listened. From the living room came a faint rustle, the sound of paper being shuffled, followed by low whispers. My pulse quickened. I moved closer, holding my breath. Through the thin wooden door, I heard Marissa's voice, soft and sharp at once. "If the accident looks real, she won't suspect a thing." For a moment, the world tilted. Accident. Who was she talking about? Then came another voice, deeper, rougher, unmistakable. A voice I thought I'd never hear again. "Krista Dalton. Once she signs the authorization form," Krista said, her tone calm and confident, "the 600 grand goes straight to the safe account. Just make sure she doesn't back out." My throat went dry. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears. 600,000. Authorization form. A fake accident. Everything clicked at once: the missing mail, the strange documents Marissa had asked me to review for insurance, updates, the sudden pressure to trust her with my medical records. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. The air in the hallway felt heavy, poisoned. Marissa laughed softly, that same sweet laugh she used to charm everyone around her. "She's old, but she's cautious. We'll have to make her believe it's her idea." Krista's reply was colder. Then do what you have to, but keep her quiet until we're done. The sound of a drawer opening followed metal scraping papers siding. I could almost picture the scene, Krista leaning over the coffee table, that familiar smirk on her face, and Marissa sitting beside her taking notes like a student. My student, I thought bitterly. Trained by the master herself. I backed away step by step, afraid the floor would creak. My legs trembled, but I forced myself not to run. Outside, the wind had picked up scattering dry leaves across the steps. I stood there for a long moment, clutching my coat, trying to breathe. Krista was alive. Not just alive, she was back in my house plotting again, this time through Marissa. That morning, I stopped being a frightened old woman. From that moment on, I became a witness. I kept listening, frozen behind the door, as their voices grew clearer. The words they used no longer sounded like vague threats or gossip. They were plans. Calculated, organized, cruel. Krista spoke first, her tone calm and professional, the way she must have sounded back in her insurance days. We stage a small accident. Nothing fatal, a car bump, a fall, something believable. She gets a mild concussion, maybe a broken wrist. Just enough for the doctors to keep her overnight. Marissa's voice trembled slightly, and after that, "That's when you come in," Krista replied. "With a medical power of attorney form. You tell the hospital you're her caregiver. They'll let you sign for her if she's unconscious or appears to be. You'll approve a transfer to the investment account, and I'll take care of the rest." My blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to trick me. They were planning to hurt me. To use my own name and my own trust against me. Marissa hesitated. "But what if she wakes up sooner?" Krista let out a quiet laugh. "She won't. I know how to manage that. You just focus on the performance. Look shaken, cry a little, tell them you're overwhelmed. People believe tears, especially from someone young and pretty." There was a pause, the sound of papers being shuffled again. Then Krista added, "I've already arranged someone to play the bank representative. He'll call you at the hospital to confirm the transfer approval. It'll look legitimate. By the time she's awake, the money will be long gone." I pressed my hand against my chest to keep from gasping. They were planning everything. The accident, the hospital, even the phone call. Every step perfectly rehearsed. Then Marissa asked the question that made my heart stop. "How do you know her inheritance is ready and the name of her lawyer?" Krista's answer was a whisper, but sharp as a blade. "Because I have the documents. All of them. The policy payout, the trust balance, even the bank's internal memo. Someone inside sent me copies months ago. I know exactly when the money moves next Tuesday." I nearly dropped the notebook clutched in my hand. Every number, every date she mentioned was correct. There was no guessing, no coincidence. My private estate information, things only my attorney should have known, had been stolen. I felt my knees weaken. The hallway spun for a moment, and I gripped the doorframe to stay upright. They had everything, my health records, my bank data, my trust details. And they were preparing to erase me before I could even react. That was when fear turned into something sharper, resolve. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one, but it would be my version. Then came the sentence that shattered whatever hope I had left. Krista's voice, steady and mocking, slipped through the thin wall like poison. "Timothy's always been soft. When it happens, he'll think it's just an accident. He'll cry, sign what he's told, and by the time he realizes, it'll all be over." For a moment, the world fell silent. My knees trembled, my pulse pounded in my ears, and I finally understood. Every strange event, every misplaced item, every sweet smile Marissa gave me, they weren't coincidences. They were chess moves. And the one moving the pieces was not Marissa. It was Krista. She hadn't disappeared. She hadn't moved on. She had been watching, waiting, studying, and now she had found a way back into my life through the only doorway she knew could break me my son. Marissa was never the mastermind. She was a hired face, a puppet with perfect timing and manufactured affection. Krista had chosen her carefully young enough to gain Timothy's sympathy, vulnerable enough to follow orders, and deceitful enough to play the role of devoted wife while executing a calculated plan. Krista didn't just want my money, she wanted humiliation. She wanted to destroy the dignity I had left after testifying against her in court years ago. Back then, when I stood on that witness stand and told the truth about her fraud, she glared at me with eyes full of venom. "You'll regret this," she'd whispered before the guards took her away. And now she was keeping her promise. I pressed my palm against the doorframe, my breathing shallow. The pieces fit too perfectly. The fake sweetness, the missing mail, the forged documents, the carefully timed accident, all designed to make me look fragile, dependent, powerless. She wanted me to become the woman she accused me of being weak, senile, disposable. Krista Dalton, once a disgraced ex-wife, had reinvented herself as the architect of revenge. This wasn't random greed, it was design. Every move traced back to her the fake accounts, the inside information, the manipulation of trust. And Timothy, my gentle boy, was just a tool in her hands, too kind to see the strings she'd tied around him. My heart ached not only from fear, but from sorrow. The son I raised with compassion was being used as a weapon against me. And worse, he didn't even know it. That realization burned through the fog of shock, replacing it with cold clarity. Krista might think she had rewritten the game, but she had forgotten one thing: I had survived her once. And this time, I was done playing defense. When Timothy came home for lunch, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread in front of me, the sunlight falling gently across the page. I smiled as if nothing in the world had changed. My hands were steady, my voice calm. To him, I was the same old mother reading the news, sipping lukewarm tea. He didn't know that every heartbeat, every breath I took was deliberate, an act in a play that would decide whether I lived or disappeared. He asked how my morning had been, and I told him lightly, "Peaceful, dear. I think I might walk a little farther tomorrow, maybe by the lake." He nodded, relieved, unaware that those words, my casual agreement, were part of the very trap I was pretending to fall into. Inside, my mind was racing. I had heard enough to know what they planned, but not enough to prove it yet. If I confronted Marissa now, she would cry, twist my words, and tell Timothy I was losing my mind. If Krista even suspected I knew the truth, she'd vanish again, erasing every trace of her scheme. And before anyone realized, I would be gone, just another elderly accident buried under paperwork and pity. That afternoon, after they both left, I went to my bedroom and locked the door. I took out the small notebook where I had written every detail, the dates, the conversations, the evidence. Next to it was the tiny voice recorder that had captured their whispers. I placed both items into a locked drawer in my dresser, then taped a small note on the inside: "Evidence open in emergency." My fingers trembled as I wrote those words. For the first time, I understood the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was survival. If anything happened to me, someone had to know the truth, even if it came too late for me. That night, I moved through the house like a ghost. I made tea for Marissa when she returned, listened to her talk about her plans for tomorrow, and nodded as if I didn't already know what those plans were. Every smile I gave was a mask. Every word I spoke was a shield. In the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, calm, sharp, unflinching. Fear had burned itself into focus. I realized I couldn't stop the storm that was coming, but I could decide how it would end. I sat on the edge of the bed, folded my hands, and whispered to the quiet room, "Let them think I'm blind. Let them believe they've already won. Because the only way to survive this, the only way to expose them, was to play their game better than they ever could." That night, the city was quiet, wrapped in a mist that clung to the streetlights like breath. I drove across town with the headlights dimmed, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. On the seat beside me were the notebook, the USB recorder, and a copy of my inheritance papers, all the proof of what was coming. The radio was off. Even the silence felt heavy. Helen Moore's office sat above an old bookstore on Cedar Avenue. The lights inside were still on when I arrived, just as she'd promised in her brief, cautious text, "Come after 9. Bring everything." Helen was more than a lawyer, she'd once been my colleague. We taught at the same high school before life pulled us in different directions. I remembered her sharp mind, her calm presence, the way she could dissect an argument without ever raising her voice. Now she specialized in elder financial abuse and probate law, exactly the kind of battle I had never imagined needing to fight. When she saw me, she stood from her desk, concern shadowing her usually steady eyes. "Lauren," she said softly, "you look like you've been carrying a storm." I placed the folder on her desk and said quietly, "It's already begun." For the next hour, I told her everything from the staged kindness to the hidden bag from the SUV, from Krista's voice behind the door to the conversation about a fake accident. I watched her expression shift from disbelief to fury to focused determination. When I finished, Helen leaned back, hands clasped. "They're preparing for attempted financial exploitation and kidnapping," she said, each word precise. "But if we play this right, we can make them incriminate themselves legally, cleanly." I stared at her, my pulse unsteady. "You mean set a trap?" "Exactly," she replied. "You'll let them think you've fallen for it. The accident, the signing, all of it. But we'll control the scene. I'll get the sheriff's office to coordinate. The moment they try to act recording devices, surveillance, police backup, it'll all be documented." She opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a tiny camera, no bigger than a button. "You'll wear this," she said. "And this USB mic, keep it in your pocket. Every word will count." For the first time in days, I felt something flicker inside me. Not fear, but resolve. Helen looked at me with a faint, reassuring smile. "You've already survived their manipulation. Now it's time to make them face the law." I knotted my throat tight. "Then we'll give them the performance they're expecting." And as I left her office that night, stepping back into the cool Cleveland air, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't walking into their trap anymore. I was walking toward justice. The next evening, Helen called me and said simply, "It's time." Her tone was calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. We met again at her office after dark, the blinds drawn tight, the city outside silent except for the low hum of passing traffic. On her desk were 2 cups of coffee, a folder stamped Cleveland Police Department, and a man in a gray suit who stood when I entered. "Mrs. Gibson," he said, extending his hand. "Lieutenant David Keller, Cleveland PD. We've met before, though it's been a long time." It took me a moment to recognize him. 15 years ago, he was the young detective who handled Krista's first fraud case, the one that ended with her probation instead of prison. Now his hair had turned silver, but his eyes were still sharp. "I never thought I'd hear that name again," he admitted, taking a seat. "But Helen told me enough to know she's back at it. This time we'll do it right." He opened the folder, revealing documents, court orders, and a small black device. "Krista Dalton is still under probation supervision. That means if she commits a single new offense, she goes straight to prison. No trial, no appeal. But we need proof. Concrete proof." Helen nodded. "And that's where you come in, Lauren. Ohio is a one-party consent state. That means as long as you agree to record the conversation, it's legal, even if they don't know." I stared at the small recorder no larger than a lipstick tube. "You want me to wear this?" Keller leaned forward. "We'll handle the monitoring from our end. You won't be alone. The minute anything seems off, we'll move in. Your phone's GPS will transmit your location directly to our unit," Helen added gently. "Every part of this has to be lawful, Lauren. We can't afford even a technicality that could set her free again. You're not just bait, you're a witness." The word witness hung in the air. It didn't feel frightening this time. It felt like purpose. Keller handed me another small device, a button-sized camera attached to a pin. This goes on your cardigan. It's motion-activated. The audio and video will upload to our secure server in real time. I took a deep breath and nodded. If she wants to play her old games, I'll give her a front-row seat to her own downfall. Keller gave a faint smile. That's the spirit, ma'am. Before I left, Helen placed a steady hand on mine. You're not doing this alone, Lauren. This time, the law stands with you. As I stepped into the cool night, I felt the weight of the tiny devices in my pocket light as air, yet heavy with justice. The trap was set. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being hunted. 3 days later, I became the woman they thought I was, the trusting, oblivious old lady who never questions anything. I put on my softest cardigan, brushed my hair into a neat bun, and practiced my smile in the mirror until it looked just the right amount of innocent. Then I took a plain white envelope, slipped in a few folded papers, and wrote in large blue letters across the front, "Bank notice urgent." That afternoon, I waited until Marissa came home. She was scrolling through her phone, pretending to be busy, when I walked into the living room waving the envelope. "Look what came in the mail," I said, letting my voice carry just enough excitement. The bank called. They said I should come in Friday to sign the withdrawal papers for the inheritance. Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. She looked up, her face calm, almost bored, but her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, flickered with something sharp. "Oh," she said lightly. "That's nice, Mom. You've been waiting a long time for that, haven't you?" I smiled, clutching the envelope. "Yes, dear. They said everything's ready now, Friday, 10 o'clock. I made sure to say the time twice slowly, as if I were reminding myself, not her. The living room camera, hidden inside a decorative vase, caught every second the glint in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her phone. She pretended to yawn, changed the subject, and walked out of the room. But the performance was over the moment she thought I couldn't see her. That night, I didn't sleep. Around midnight, faint voices drifted down the hallway. I slipped on my robe and stood by the door. Marissa's voice was low, urgent, the kind she used when she thought no one was listening. "Friday, 10 o'clock. Everything's set," she whispered into her phone. "She doesn't suspect a thing." I felt my heart race, but I stayed quiet, memorizing every word. A soft click followed, then silence. She had made the call that would finally trap her. The next morning, I drove straight to Helen's office, handed her the new recording, and said, "It's time." Helen listened, her expression tightening with each second. "This is it," she said. "This is enough." Within hours, she forwarded the audio file to Lieutenant Keller, who sent it to the district attorney's office. By afternoon, they had secured a temporary surveillance order for the upcoming transaction. The police would be ready, cameras, plainclothes officers, and a team positioned near the bank. For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance shift. The trap wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. That Thursday morning felt like preparing for a school play, except the stakes were real, and the audience could be prison bars. Helen arrived with a small toolkit and a determined look that made me feel both safe and terribly exposed. We moved through the living room like stagehands, lifting a porcelain vase, sliding a tiny camera into its hollow, then positioning a second camera behind the glass of a picture frame so the lens would catch anyone who sat on the sofa. We tested angles, adjusted heights, and Helen peered through the camera feed on her tablet, like a director approving the set. She placed a backup audio recorder in the shoe cabinet, where no one would think to look, and marked its case with a little piece of tape so I could find it in the panic of a real emergency. When Lieutenant Keller arrived, he brought seriousness and a quiet efficiency that made the plan feel inevitable. He explained how his team would be stationed on the floor below, waiting in vans and out of sight, and how they would only move when they got the safety phrase on my phone and on the live audio feed. The phrase was simple and domestic to sound natural in our home. The code words were, "Mother feels cold." Keller said those words once slow to make sure they fit my voice in a natural sentence. He told me that the moment his unit heard those words, they would be moving into the bank and into any place needed to intercept the supposed transfer. He also showed me the live GPS tracking on my phone and told me that a unit would always know my exact location. We rehearsed the conversation I would have with Marissa. Helen coached me to mention the bank visit casually while folding a napkin to let the words slip as if by accident. She told me to say that the bank wanted me to sign papers on Friday at 10. She coached the rhythm, the pauses, the way an old woman might repeat the time aloud to remember. I practiced until the lines sounded like my own thoughts. I wanted the recorded exchange to feel ordinary, unscripted, a natural bait that would not give the smugness away. That evening, I wrote a letter by hand to Timothy and left it on his pillow. The ink trembled slightly as I wrote. The note said that if he ever read it, he should remember that truth is stronger than fear and that love should not blind him to what is right. I did not want to humiliate him. I wanted him back. I folded the paper and put it where only he would find it. The apartment felt different after the cameras were placed and the police vans parked below. Every light seemed to shine with purpose. I sat on the sofa and imagined the scene to come, the actors moving into place without knowing they were being filmed. It was a strange comfort to turn my own living room into a courtroom set. The house had been used against me for too long. Now, with careful preparation, the house would tell the truth. For the next 2 days, I became an actress in my own home. Every movement, every word, every smile was a performance rehearsed in silence. I cooked breakfast as usual, stirring oatmeal and humming an old tune, even though my stomach churned with nerves. Marissa sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone pretending to be bored, and I asked her if she wanted more sugar in her coffee. She looked up surprised by my tone, warm, effortless, almost affectionate. That was the point. She had to believe I was still blind to everything. When Timothy came home from work, he seemed lighter, almost happy for the first time in weeks. "It's nice to see you two getting along," he said, setting his bag down. I smiled at him the way mothers do when they want to protect their children from ugly truths. "We're trying," I replied softly. He hugged me a quick, gentle hug, and I had to bite my lip not to cry. If only he knew the reason I smiled was not reconciliation, but strategy. Marissa played her part, too. She offered to help with dinner, complimented my soup, even called me Mom again, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. I nodded and thanked her, pretending not to see through the performance. It was a strange dance, 2 women circling each other, both smiling, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. Each time Timothy left for work, the mask slipped for just a moment. My smile faded, my shoulders trembled, and I would check every device. The vase camera still recording, the frame camera perfectly aligned, the microphone in the shoe cabinet light blinking green. I opened my phone and verified the GPS signal Keller had set. Every dot, every signal was still alive. My hands shook, but my eyes stayed steady. Fear was no longer my enemy. It had become my discipline. That evening, Helen called. Her voice, calm but firm, came through the speaker. "Lauren, you're doing brilliantly. Just one more day. Remember, you're not only protecting your money, you're protecting dignity itself for every older woman who's ever been dismissed or silenced." I didn't answer right away. I looked around my kitchen, the same room where I'd once been told I was too old to manage things where I'd been quietly pushed aside in my own home. I thought of every woman who had been told the same lie. Then I said, We'll make sure they never say it again." When I hung up, I returned to the stove stirring the soup, as if nothing had changed. The house smelled of rosemary and calm deceit. I could feel the camera behind me watching recording. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of being seen. I wanted them, the law, the world, to see me exactly as I was. Not a helpless old woman, but a mother preparing the final act of truth. Friday morning arrived like a storm disguised as calm. I dressed simply in my gray wool coat and flat shoes, carrying the same white envelope that had started it all. I drove to the bank as planned, parked, and walked inside, just long enough to be seen by the surveillance cameras. I smiled at the teller, withdrew nothing, and then drove back home, heart pounding, breath steady, every movement deliberate. The game had begun. When I opened the door, I immediately felt it, the stillness of a trap already sprung. The living room lights were on, though no one had been home. The faint scent of Marissa's perfume mingled with another sharper one, a memory I could never mistake. Krista Dalton stepped out from the hallway first, her lips curved in that same mocking smile I remembered from years ago. Marissa followed behind, closing the door softly and sliding the lock in place with a metallic click. "Well, look who came home early," Krista said, her voice smooth but laced with triumph. "We were starting to worry you'd forget our little meeting." I forced a trembling laugh, clutching the envelope to my chest. "What's going on? Why are you two here?" Marissa crossed her arms, tone suddenly cold. "Don't play innocent, Mom. You know exactly what this is. We just need you to sign some papers so everything stays peaceful." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression confused. Fragile, harmless, exactly the role I had practiced. "Papers I don't understand." Krista lifted the folder in her hand. "Medical authorization, financial transfer. Nothing dramatic. Just a few signatures to keep the bank from freezing your account after today's withdrawal." She placed the papers on the table, tapping a pen against them. "Sign, and this all goes away." I stepped back slowly, and if I don't, her smile vanished. Then things get complicated. Behind her, Marissa's hands trembled slightly, not with guilt, but with tension. She wasn't the leader anymore. She was following orders. I could see it now, the hierarchy of greed written in their eyes. The camera hidden inside the picture frame caught everything: the closed door, the threats, the moment Krista stepped too close. I took a shaky breath and let the words fall from my mouth naturally, just as Helen and Keller had planned. "It's so cold in here," I said softly, voice trembling. "Mother feels cold." The signal was sent. Krista didn't notice. She leaned in, hissing, "Sign the damn papers, Lauren." I looked at her, calm, almost pitying. "You always did underestimate me, Krista." And then from outside came the sharp echo of boots on the stairwell. The front door burst open, and uniformed officers rushed in, shouting commands. Krista froze, eyes wide, as Marissa gasped. For a moment, no one moved. Then the envelope slipped from my hand, and for the first time, I allowed myself to stop acting. The door burst open with a thunderous crack that shattered the tension like glass. For a split second, the entire room froze, the air thick with shock, fear, and justice. Then Helen Moore stepped in first, her expression calm and resolute, followed by Lieutenant Keller and two uniformed officers with their weapons drawn and badges gleaming under the morning light. Krista Dalton and Marissa Fordham. Keller's voice rang out steady and commanding. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, extortion, and premeditated kidnapping." He moved forward as the officers fanned out, blocking every exit. The sound of handcuffs clinking echoed faintly, like the closing of a final chapter. Helen set her tablet on the table with deliberate care and tapped the screen. Instantly, the living room filled with the unmistakable sound of their own voices, recorded crystal clear. From the hidden cameras came the image of Krista and Marissa standing in the same spot, discussing their plan without a shred of hesitation. Krista's voice crackled through the speakers. Once she signs the authorization form, the 600 grand goes straight into my account. The words hung in the air, damning and undeniable. Marissa's face went pale as the reality sank in every whisper, every threat, every word had been captured and was now evidence. She stumbled backward, her breath shallow. No, this can't be legal, she stammered. Helen met her eyes, her voice sharp but steady. Oh, it's perfectly legal. Ohio is a one-party consent state, Miss Fordham. Every word you said was recorded with Mrs. Gibson's full consent. Krista's calm shattered. She slammed her hands on the table and screamed. She set us up. That old witch tricked us. Lieutenant Keller's gaze hardened. No, Ms. Dalton, he said coldly. You set yourself up. You planned, you schemed, and you left a trail of greed a mile wide. The difference is, this time the law was watching. The officers moved in, securing their wrists in metal cuffs. Marissa began to sob, the tears loud and sudden, but Krista's face twisted with rage and disbelief. You'll regret this, she spat toward me. You think this makes you a hero? I stood still, my hands folded in front of me. My voice came out calm, almost gentle. No, Krista. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who finally stopped being afraid. Helen touched my shoulder lightly as Keller read them their rights. The words sounded distant, almost ceremonial, like the closing lines of a long play. As the officers led the two women out, the door swung open again, the same door they had locked minutes ago, now the very door justice had entered through. For the first time in years, the house felt safe again. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway before anyone inside could speak. The door creaked open, and there stood Timothy, my son, still in his bakery uniform, holding a white box tied with a red ribbon. His face lit with a hesitant smile, at first the kind that comes before an apology. But the smile froze when he saw the scene before him. Two women, his wife and his ex-wife, stood in the middle of the living room, handcuffed, their faces pale under the morning light. Behind them, Lieutenant Keller and the officers stood silent, the air thick with finality. The birthday cake box slipped slightly in Timothy's grasp, tilting as though it carried the weight of everything he had failed to see. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan and Marissa's uneven breathing. Then in a trembling voice, she took a step toward him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Tim, listen to me. I did it for us, she cried, grabbing for his sleeve. Everything I did, it was for our future. Timothy stepped back, his eyes clouded with disbelief. For us, he repeated the words, hollow, breaking. You lied. You hurt my mother. You tried to take everything from her. Marissa shook her head violently, her voice cracking. No, it wasn't like that. She's lying. I was trying to protect what's ours. Her voice wavered, desperate now, but even she seemed to realize how weak it sounded. The officers stood motionless. The truth no longer needed defense. Krista sneered from where she stood, cuffed and silent, until now. You think you're better than us, she spat, glaring at me. You played your little game too, old woman. Helen stepped forward calmly. Save it, Ms. Dalton. The law doesn't take sides, it takes evidence. Timothy looked from one woman to the other, his expression collapsing under the weight of it all. The disbelief gave way to shame, a deep, quiet shame that aged him in seconds. He turned to me, then his eyes wet, his voice barely a whisper. Mom, I didn't know. I looked at him not with anger, not even with relief, but with a kind of sorrow that comes only from love too long tested. I know, son, I said softly. Now you do. He lowered his head, clutching the cake box tighter, as if realizing it was a relic from a version of life that no longer existed. As the officers led Krista and Marissa toward the door, Timothy stood still, the boy I raised, and the man he was becoming overlapping in one broken silhouette. When he finally looked up, I saw it in his eyes, the guilt, the clarity, and the beginning of something fragile understanding. And in that moment, I felt both the ache of loss and the quiet triumph of truth. Krista thrashed violently as the officers tightened the cuffs around her wrists. Her hair fell across her face, her voice hoarse and sharp. She tricked us. She set us up. That old woman planned everything. She screamed, her words echoing off the walls like a desperate plea to rewrite what everyone had already seen. I stood still, my heartbeat steady now, the tremor in my hands fading as I looked at her, not with victory, but with clarity. My voice came out calm, even every word measured like the steps of a teacher correcting a final mistake. "No, Krista," I said quietly. "You chose that road yourself. I didn't set a trap. I only placed a mirror. And what you saw in it was who you've always been." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick, unshakable, final. Marissa turned her face away, sobbing into her cuffed hands. Keller signaled to the officers, and they began leading the two women toward the door. Their footsteps were heavy, dragging through the remnants of a broken scheme. When the door opened, a rush of noise spilled in from outside. Camera shutters, murmurs from reporters, flashes of light bouncing off the hallway walls. The story had already begun spreading. A local journalist whispered to another elder financial abuse perfect case example. Clean evidence. Ironclad documentation. The term sounded clinical, almost detached, but I knew what it meant. My story would no longer just be mine. It would become a warning for others like me, for women who had been told to stay quiet, to forgive, to endure. Krista turned back one last time, her face twisted with defiance and humiliation. But no words came. She had already said enough, and this time the truth was louder than her voice. As the door finally closed behind them, the house exhaled. It felt lighter, as if the air itself had been waiting for this moment. Helen remained by my side, her expression soft, a quiet pride glimmering behind her calm professionalism. She leaned closer and said in a low voice, meant only for me, "You just taught them the most expensive lesson of their lives, that greed will never outsmart wisdom, especially the wisdom of a teacher." Her words sank deep. I lowered myself into the armchair, the same spot where I had once been told to leave my own home. My hands still trembled, but the shake came, not from fear, from release. I took a long breath, feeling the room settle around me. Outside, the flashing lights dimmed, and the murmurs faded into the distance. Inside, truth lingered, steady, undeniable. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need revenge. The law had spoken. The truth had been heard. And for the first time in years, I felt what peace truly sounded, like the kind that doesn't roar, but resonates. The courtroom was packed the morning the verdict was read. The air carried that sharp mix of perfume paper and tension, the scent of judgment. Krista sat stiffly beside her attorney, face drained of color, while Marissa, pale and trembling, clutched a tissue that had long since stopped absorbing her tears. Across the aisle, I sat quietly between Helen and Lieutenant Keller, hands folded, eyes steady. I didn't come to see them punished. I came to see the truth acknowledged. When the judge's gavel struck, the sound echoed like the closing of a long, painful chapter. Krista Dalton, 10 years in state prison. Marissa Fordham, 7 years. Both defendants are found guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, financial fraud, and unlawful trespass. Their assets were frozen, every dollar accounted for, every lie documented. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched. Reporters whispered as they prepared their headlines. By afternoon, the news was everywhere. Scheming daughters-in-law tried to steal from retired teacher. Mother-in-law, justice served. The story spread across Ohio, not as gossip, but as warning. It was no longer about me. It had become a symbol of what too many older women silently endure. Outside the courthouse, Timothy faced the press. He stood behind the microphones, pale but determined. His voice cracked when he said, "I failed to protect my mother. I let love blind me twice. But I've learned that real love starts with respect, not control." Reporters wrote down every word. When he turned toward me, our eyes met briefly. I nodded, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Some lessons have to scar before they heal. That evening, the news replayed the moment of the arrests, the courtroom footage, and a photograph of me leaving the courthouse with Helen's hand on my shoulder. The anchor's voice called the case a landmark example of elder financial abuse and justice through resilience. I turned off the television after that. I didn't need to hear my name anymore. At home, the apartment felt too quiet. The same walls that had once echoed with deceit now held only silence, clean, honest silence. I began tidying up one small act at a time, folding the blankets, straightening the books, wiping down the table where so many lies had once been told. On the shelf stood a framed photo of Timothy's wedding smiling faces that no longer told the truth. I took it down, gently opened the back, and slid the photo into the drawer of my desk. Justice didn't feel like triumph. It felt like air returning after years of holding my breath. I sat down looking around the apartment that was mine again, not just legally, but spiritually. For the first time in a long while, peace didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't need music or words. I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, the same kind I used to brew for my students before exams. The sunlight spilled gently across the table, catching the edges of the small chrysanthemum pot I had planted myself. The flowers had begun to bloom again, bright, steady, unapologetically alive. Timothy had moved out 2 weeks earlier, renting a small apartment near his bakery downtown. He came by sometimes bringing fresh bread or just standing in the doorway, unsure how to fill the silence between us. I didn't push. Some wounds needed quiet more than conversation. Today, he stopped by with a bag of croissants. He didn't say much, but when our eyes met, I saw it, the calm after understanding. He wasn't the same man who once doubted me. There was gentleness now, and a slow, honest respect that only comes after truth breaks everything open. After he left, Helen arrived as she often did without warning and with too much energy for someone her age. She brought a file of papers but set it aside as soon as she saw my face. "You're glowing," she teased, hanging her coat. "Retirement suits you. Or maybe it's the victory of seeing justice done." I laughed softly. "You always think in legal terms. For me, it wasn't about winning. It was about stopping the silence." Helen smiled, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Still, you beat the hardest game of all, the game of trust." I looked out the window at the sun shifting through the leaves and said quietly, "Sometimes revenge doesn't need knives or noise. Sometimes it's enough to let the truth reveal itself." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was warm, the tea fragrant, the sound of a child playing somewhere in the distance. Life had returned to its simple rhythm, and that was enough. I reached for my notebook, not the one filled with evidence, but a new one, and wrote down the sentence that had stayed with me since the day of the verdict. Justice doesn't shout. It endures. I closed the notebook and watched the sunlight move slowly across the wall. Somewhere inside, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, not the peace of forgetting, but of understanding. If you have ever been used, dismissed, or silenced because of your age or your kindness, don't stay quiet. Tell your story. Because justice doesn't start in courtrooms, it starts when we finally dare to speak.